The Arizona Territory in late winter had a way of holding its breath. The mornings came cold and brittle, the frost clinging to the tips of the mesquite like stubborn ghosts. Luke Carver rose before the first smear of sunlight touched the ridgeline, moving through his small cabin with the quiet efficiency of a man long used to his own company. The floorboards complained faintly under his boots, but otherwise, the place stayed still. That stillness was what he'd sought for years, and what he'd held on to with both hands since the war and everything that followed. His hands were work-scarred, the skin rough from rope and reins, from splitting wood and mending what no one else was around to fix. He moved slow but steady, tending to the stove first, not because he felt the cold more than most, but because there was comfort in the ritual. The fire caught, the coffee pot found its place, and the cabin filled with that familiar bitter smell that had become his morning companion. Outside, the land stretched wide and open, broken only by the low rise of hills in the distance and the stubborn fence lines he'd built himself. His cattle were scattered across the winter-browned grass, moving in that lazy, deliberate way that animals do when they know no one's rushing them. Luke preferred it that way. He'd had enough of noise, enough of people talking just to fill the air, enough of orders barked and promises broken. Out here, a man could let the silence be what it was, not emptiness, but a kind of balm. It hadn't always been like this. There had been laughter once, and the sound of small feet running across these same floorboards. There had been a woman's voice humming in the kitchen, a child's high-pitched questions tumbling out one after another. But those sounds had gone quiet, in the cruel way only the West could manage. Sudden, permanent, without warning or mercy. He didn't speak of it, not even to himself. Instead, he kept his grief tucked away in the same place he kept his rifle, close at hand, worn smooth from use, and never far from reach. The people in town knew him, though not well. They called him the Quiet One, or that Carver fella out by the ridge. He went in when he had to. Flour, coffee, salt, the bare necessities. He nodded when someone spoke to him, answered if pressed, and left before the conversation could turn to anything more. There was nothing for him in those crowded streets. The world he'd chosen was out here, where the only voices were wind, cattle, and the scrape of his boots on dry earth. Most days followed the same shape. Feed the stock, check the water troughs, mend what needed mending. If the weather held, he might ride out to the far pasture to check the fence line, his horse's steady gait matching the rhythm of his thoughts. He wasn't a man to dwell, but sometimes the past crept in like smoke through a crack, uninvited and hard to ignore. When that happened, he worked harder, driving himself into exhaustion so the dreams wouldn't find him so easily at night. The cabin itself was plain, but kept in good order. Every tool had a place. Every surface was clean. There was no one to notice, but Luke kept it that way out of habit. Order was something a man could control when the rest of the world refused to be tamed. The walls were bare except for a single photograph, faded now, the edges curling, of a younger Luke with his arm around a woman whose smile could have lit the whole territory. Beside her, a boy barely old enough to walk, clutching a wooden horse. Luke didn't look at it often, but he never moved it either. By mid-afternoon, the sun would warm the land enough to shed his coat. He'd sit on the porch sometimes, coffee cup in hand, letting the hours pass without needing to fill them. The land didn't ask for anything more than what he could give. That was the bargain he'd struck with himself. Stay alive, tend the place, keep the ghosts at bay. But even in a life so carefully constructed, change has a way of finding its way in. Luke didn't know it yet, But the winter would not pass as quietly as the ones before. Something, or rather, someone, was already making her way toward his land, carrying with her a silence of her own. And before long, his steady, ordered days would tilt, the stillness between these walls shifting into something altogether different. For now, though, Luke moved through his chores with the steady patience of a man who had learned not to rush the day. The sun dipped lower, staining the sky with copper and rose. He brought the cattle in closer to the barn, shut the gates, and checked the locks without really thinking about it. His hands knew the motions, his mind somewhere else entirely. Night would come soon, the stars spilling across the dark in numbers too great to count. Luke would sit at the table, eat his supper in the same silence he'd kept all day, then bank the fire and turn in early. He didn't expect anything different. And yet, in the cold dark of that night, the quiet life he had so carefully preserved would take its first, irreversible step toward change. Somewhere out there, just beyond the edge of his fences, a figure was moving toward him, bruised, tired, and carrying a story neither of them yet knew they would share. The wind had changed sometime after midnight, carrying with it a raw, sharp bite that whispered of snow in the higher country. Luke lay half awake in his bed, listening to the old cabin creak under the pressure. Nights like this, sound traveled differently, sharper, more brittle. He could hear the wind rattling the loose hinge on the shed door, the occasional groan of the barn settling in the cold. All of it was familiar, part of the night's language out here. But there was something else. It was faint at first, a muffled shift of hay, a scuff that didn't belong to any of his animals. Luke's eyes opened the rest of the way, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Coyotes didn't move like that. Neither did the barn cats. This was slower, heavier, human. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the floorboards cool under his bare feet. His rifle leaned in its usual place by the door, and he took it without thought, working the action with a soft, practiced click. The air inside the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and the lingering bitterness of coffee. But the moment he stepped outside, the cold cut through him, bringing with it the dry scent of winter grass. And something else, the faint metallic tang of fear, though whether it was his or someone else's, he couldn't say. The moon was thin and pale, its light barely brushing the edge of the barn. His boots made almost no sound as he crossed the yard. Years of habit teaching him where the ground would give and where it would hold. Each step was deliberate, his senses tuned to every noise, the rattle of the wind, the far-off bark of a coyote, and that same faint rustle from within the barn. The big sliding door gave a low groan when he eased it open, the darkness inside swallowing him. His breath came out in slow clouds as he let his eyes adjust. The horses shifted in their stalls, ears flicking toward him, but otherwise calm. Whatever had come here hadn't spooked them enough to bolt. That told him something. This wasn't an attack. This was something, someone, trying to disappear. It didn't take long to find her. She was crouched in the farthest corner, half hidden behind a stack of hay bales, her shape small but tense, like a wild thing backed into a corner. A blanket, no, not a blanket, but some worn piece of cloth, was wrapped around her shoulders, doing little to hide the way she was shivering. Her hair was a tangle, her face in shadow, but he could see the dirt smeared across her cheek, the thin set of her mouth. Luke didn't speak right away. Words had a way of pushing people further into themselves, and he knew the look of someone holding on by a thread. Instead, he lowered the rifle, letting the barrel rest loosely in his hand. He stepped forward just enough that the light from the door caught his face. She didn't move. Her eyes followed him, wide and watchful, the kind of eyes that had seen more than they should have. "You lost?" he asked finally, his voice low, steady. She hesitated, then shook her head once, quick and sharp. Her hands were knotted in the fabric around her, fingers thin and pale. Luke studied her a moment longer, then sighed through his nose. "Hungry?" This time, there was the smallest flicker, a pause, a swallow, and then the faintest nod. That was enough. He backed away, motioning for her to stay where she was, and stepped out into the night again. The cold hit harder now, and he moved quicker across the yard, his boots crunching on the frosted ground. In the cabin, he stoked the fire, set a pot on, and pulled down the bread he'd baked 2 days ago. The smell of warmth began to fill the room, coffee, bread, and the faint sizzle of beans in the pan. When he went back, she was still in the corner, still wrapped tight, but her eyes had shifted from suspicion to something else. Not trust, not yet, but a readiness to move. "Come on," he said, jerking his head toward the door. "It's warmer inside." For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she rose, her bare feet silent on the packed dirt. She kept her distance as they crossed the yard, her gaze flicking between him and the dark horizon, as if ready to bolt at any sign of danger. Inside, the cabin's heat seemed to stop her in her tracks. She stood near the door, her back to the wall, watching him as he set the food down on the table. He didn't press her. He simply sat, poured himself coffee, and pushed the plate toward the empty chair. It took her a long moment, but eventually she crossed the room and lowered herself into the seat. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bread, breaking off small pieces and eating them like someone who wasn't sure there'd be another meal. Luke didn't ask her name. Not yet. Out here, names could be dangerous things to hand over too soon. He just watched her eat, the firelight catching the sharp angles of her face, the faint bruise along her jaw. Somewhere deep down, he knew, in that quiet, unshakable way a man knows when his life is about to change, that she wouldn't be gone by morning. Dawn came slowly over the ridge, pale light spilling across the frost-tipped grass and sliding through the thin curtain at the cabin window. Inside, the air was still warm from the night's fire, though the wood in the stove had settled into a bed of glowing embers. The smell of coffee began to bloom in the small space, dark and earthy, curling into the corners like a quiet invitation. Luke moved with the ease of a man long accustomed to mornings that asked for no words. He filled the kettle, set it over the heat, then pulled down the flour tin from the shelf. The soft scrape of the tin lid and the muted thump of dough on the table were the only sounds besides the low crackle of the stove. He worked without looking toward the far end of the cabin, though he knew she was there. She had curled herself into the narrow cot near the hearth, the same way she had huddled in the barn the night before, knees drawn up, back tight against the wall, her eyes closing only when exhaustion finally overtook the watchfulness in them. At some point during the night, she had slipped into stillness, her breathing soft and steady. Now, as the scent of coffee deepened and the first sound of birds stirred beyond the walls, she shifted. It was a small movement, the rustle of the blanket and the faint creak of the cot, but Luke heard it. He kept his hands in the dough, giving her time. When she finally sat up, her hair fell in tangled waves around her face. She blinked at the room as though making sure it was real, her gaze landing on the table where he worked, then sliding toward the stove. Her bare feet touched the floor gingerly, as if testing its warmth, before she rose. Luke glanced up once, meeting her eyes for the briefest moment before returning to his work. "Coffee'll be ready in a minute," he said, his voice quiet, almost casual. She hesitated by the chair across from him, fingers clutching the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes flicked to the loaf of bread cooling near the stove, then to the pot of beans simmering low. Hunger was there, not just for food, but for something steadier, something that wouldn't vanish when she reached for it. He cut the dough into rough biscuits, setting each on the pan before sliding it into the stove. The warm scent of baking began to mingle with the coffee, filling the space between them. "You can sit," he added, not as a command, but as a quiet allowance. She did, slowly lowering herself into the chair, the blanket pooling in her lap. For a long moment, neither spoke. Luke poured the coffee, pushing one mug across the table to her. She eyed it like it might be a trick, then wrapped her hands around it, drawing in the steam before taking the smallest sip. Her face softened just a fraction, the warmth settling into her. "You got a name?" Luke asked after a while. Her fingers tightened around the mug. She looked down at the coffee, then out the small window where frost still clung to the edges of the glass. "Nielli," she said finally, the sound of it quiet, but certain. Luke nodded once. "All right, Nielli." He didn't press for more. Out here, names were enough to start with. The biscuits came out golden and hot, their tops splitting with steam. He set two on her plate, added a scoop of beans, and pushed it toward her. She hesitated only a heartbeat this time before picking up the bread, tearing off a piece and tasting it. They ate in the steady rhythm of people who understood that food was its own kind of truce. Between bites, Nielli's gaze roamed the room, the worn shelves lined with jars, the rifle above the door, the coat hung neatly by the wall. It was a lived-in space, but spare, as if its owner had long ago decided that less was easier to carry. When the plates were empty and the coffee gone, Luke rose and pulled on his coat. "I've got work in the barn," he said. "You're welcome to stay inside where it's warm." For a moment, she looked like she might refuse, as if staying meant owing something she couldn't pay. Then she nodded, her shoulders easing just slightly. Luke stepped outside, the cold air hitting him like a clean blade. Behind him, the cabin door stayed shut. He worked the morning chores with the same measured pace as always, though he caught himself glancing toward the window once or twice. She didn't appear there, didn't watch him. But when he returned, the blanket had been folded neatly on the cot, and the mugs were rinsed and set upside down by the basin. She was still by the hearth, sitting cross-legged on the floor, her hands stretched toward the warmth. When she looked up at him, something in her expression had shifted. Not trust, not yet. But the edge of flight in her eyes had dulled, replaced by the smallest flicker of staying. Luke felt it then, the quiet weight of change settling over the morning. It wasn't loud, and it didn't need to be. Out here, the first step toward belonging was often taken in silence. The day after that first morning broke warmer, the frost softening to dew in the pale light. The wind had shifted during the night, carrying the faint scent of pine and far-off rain. Nielli woke earlier this time, the fire in the stove still alive, its glow cutting through the shadowed corners of the cabin. She sat quietly for a while, the blanket around her shoulders, listening to the way the place breathed, the slow crackle of embers, the distant drip of melted frost from the eaves, the faint scrape of metal on wood from outside. She knew Luke was already at work. Men like him moved with the sun, not clocks, their bodies long tuned to the rhythms of the land. When she rose, she didn't slip straight back into stillness. Instead, she crossed to the table, running her fingers lightly over its scarred surface. She'd noticed the marks yesterday, some deep and clean, like knife cuts, others softer, worn in over years of elbows and plates. It was a table that had been kept, not replaced. She found the water basin and washed her face, the chill making her eyes water. The bar of soap was plain, scentless, but smooth from use. She placed it back exactly as she found it. By the time Luke stepped through the door, carrying an armful of split kindling, she was at the hearth, coaxing the fire higher. He paused in the doorway, a small flicker of surprise in his eyes before he moved past her to set the wood down. "You're up early," he said. She didn't answer right away. Speaking still felt like stepping onto thin ice. You never knew where the cracks were. But after a moment, she murmured, "Couldn't sleep." Luke nodded, like that made sense. He hung his coat, poured water into the kettle, and reached for the coffee tin. The smell rose between them again, grounding, familiar. This time, when they ate, Nielli offered him the first biscuit from the pan without being asked. It wasn't much, just a small turn of the hand, but it caught him off guard. He accepted it with a nod. After breakfast, Luke went back outside, but Nielli didn't stay by the fire. She stood in the doorway for a while, the blanket over her shoulders, watching him. He moved easily among the chores, feeding the horses, checking the fence line, pulling a tarp over a stack of wood. The animals seemed to know his shape and scent. They lifted their heads when he approached, but not with fear. At one point, he caught her looking. He didn't wave or call out, just gave the smallest nod, a quiet acknowledgement that she'd been seen without being summoned. By midday, clouds had gathered over the ridge. The air shifted again, heavy with the promise of rain. Luke came inside to cut strips of leather near the table, his knife moving with sure, practiced strokes. Nielli sat nearby, mending a tear in the blanket she'd used, the needle glinting in the light from the window. For a long while, there was only the sound of work, leather pulling under the blade, thread slipping through cloth. But slowly, something else wove its way in. Luke began humming under his breath, not a song she recognized, but something low and steady, like the kind of sound you make without meaning to when the day feels settled. It made her hands pause, just for a moment. She couldn't remember the last time she'd heard that kind of sound, unguarded, almost careless. That night, the rain came. It drummed against the roof and tapped the window panes, turning the world beyond into a blur. Luke stoked the fire higher, the heat pushing back against the damp. Nielli sat closer to it than she had before, stretching her legs out to warm her feet. When he set a cup of tea in front of her, she met his eyes long enough to say, "Thank you." It wasn't loud, but it was the first time she'd looked at him without the wall in her gaze. He didn't smile, but something eased in the set of his shoulders. "You're welcome." Later, when she lay down, the rain's rhythm against the roof was almost enough to lull her. Almost. Sleep still didn't come easily, but she didn't lie there listening for footsteps or the creak of a door. That was new. Luke, from his place on the other side of the room, listened too. Not for danger, though that instinct never left him, but for the sound of her breathing. It was steadier now, no longer caught on the edge of flight. He didn't think of it as progress, not in the way people might measure such things. Out here, trust wasn't built in leaps. It grew the way frost melted in morning light, slow, almost invisible, until one day you realized it was gone. When the fire burned low, Luke added another log, the small flare of light catching on her hair where it spilled across the pillow. She didn't stir. It was enough. The storm didn't linger. By morning, the air was rinsed clean, the earth dark and rich beneath their boots. The ridge above the cabin gleamed where the sun caught on wet stone, and water still whispered in the grass from the night's rain. Luke stepped outside with his coffee, the steam curling into the cool air. He saw Nielli by the small shed, her hair loose, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She was studying the latch, tilting her head slightly as if committing its shape to memory. It was the first time he'd found her outside without him. That alone told him something was shifting. When she noticed him, she didn't startle, didn't fold back into herself. Instead, she stepped aside, as though giving him space to pass, though her eyes flickered briefly toward the hills before returning to the shed. That little glance carried weight, not fear exactly, but awareness. He joined her without asking why she was there. "Need something?" She hesitated, then gestured toward the coil of rope hanging inside. "For the fence," she said, her voice soft but sure. Luke nodded and reached for it, but she was already stepping in to take it herself. The movement was quick, almost a reflex, and when her fingers brushed his, she didn't pull back immediately. That was another small thing, easy to overlook, unless you'd been watching the way she'd moved since she arrived, always careful to keep space between them. The day stretched long with work. The ground was slick from the rain, so Luke took the lower pasture slow, checking for washouts along the fence line. Nielli followed at a distance at first, then drew closer, watching the way he tested posts and tightened wire. Before long, she was crouching beside him, holding the wire taut while he set the staple. They didn't speak much. Words weren't necessary for this kind of work. But at one point, when the hammer slipped and caught his knuckle, she reached for his hand without thinking. Her grip was light, her brow furrowed as she looked at the scrape. "It's not bad," she murmured, but her touch lingered a moment longer than it needed to. By midday, the clouds had burned off, leaving the air warmer than it had been in days. Luke stripped off his coat and draped it over the fence, catching Nielli's eyes flick toward it. Not at the coat itself, but at the space between where he stood and where she could stand, if she chose to rest. She didn't move there, not yet, but later, when they paused by the creek, she sat beside him on the fallen log instead of across from him. It was nothing to most people, but to Luke, it felt like the slow unfurling of a hand long clenched. Back at the cabin, she went straight to the stove, filling the kettle without being asked. He watched from the table as she moved, still quiet, still precise, but no longer as though she feared taking up too much space. While the tea steeped, she glanced at the shelf above the hearth. "Those yours?" she asked, nodding toward the small row of books. "Some," he said. "Others were here when I came." She studied the spines, tracing the faded gold lettering with her eyes. He could see the moment she recognized a title. Her expression softened, almost wistful, but she didn't say which one it was. That night, she didn't wait for him to offer the first plate at supper. She served both, sliding his across the table before taking her own seat. They ate in companionable quiet, the fire throwing a steady glow over the worn floorboards. When he reached for his cup, he caught her watching him, not with suspicion, but with something quieter. Curiosity, maybe, or a kind of measuring. Later, as they settled in for the night, the wind rose again, rattling the shutters. Luke saw her glance toward the door, not out of fear, but habit. He said nothing, only banked the fire and set the bar across the latch with a firm, final sound. She lay down without her blanket pulled so tight around her, one arm resting outside its fold. Her breathing came slow and even. Luke watched for a moment longer before settling into his own place. Trust didn't come here in grand gestures or sudden declarations. It came in the way a person stood a little closer, in the way they reached without flinching, in the space they claimed without apology. And tonight, Nielli had done all three. He let the thought sit with him as the fire's glow faded, knowing better than to name it aloud. Some things, the important things, needed the quiet to grow. The wind had stilled by morning, leaving the world hushed in a way that made even the smallest sounds seem louder. The crunch of boots on the frost-crusted ground, the slow exhale of the mare in the paddock, the faint creak of the porch boards under weight. Luke stepped outside to find Nielli already there, her hands wrapped around a tin cup, her breath fogging in the cold. She didn't turn when he joined her, but she didn't step away either. Her gaze was fixed on the distant ridge where the sun's first light was spilling over the top, catching in the threads of mist that lingered in the low draws. "You're up early," he said, his voice low in the stillness. She nodded. "Couldn't sleep." Her words carried no edge, just a quiet admission. He sipped his coffee, letting the silence sit between them. There was a weight in the air, not the kind that pressed down, but the kind that held possibility, fragile and untested. After a moment, she glanced at him, not full on, but enough for him to see the shadow of a question in her eyes. "How long have you been here?" Luke considered the answer. 5 years, give or take." "Always alone?" she asked, the words soft but steady. He nodded. "Since the war ended." He didn't add the rest, the names and faces left behind, the loss that had hollowed out the middle of him. She seemed to understand anyway. Her eyes lingered on his a beat longer, then she looked back toward the ridge. "I don't know what it's like, to choose being alone." That caught him off guard. "And you?" he asked. Her fingers tightened on the tin cup. "Alone was never mine to choose. It was just given to me, the same way you give someone a name or a place at a table." She breathed out slow, and her shoulders lowered a fraction, as if speaking had taken something from her. Luke let the words settle. He knew better than to push, but the fact she'd said even that much felt like a door cracking open. Later, they worked side by side in the barn, the smell of damp hay and leather wrapping around them. Nielli moved with more certainty now, her steps sure on the worn boards, her hands quick in mending a torn feed sack. At one point, as she tied off the repair, she spoke without looking up. "Where I was, there was no choice to speak. Words could be taken as weapons or invitations. Both could cost you." Luke's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. "You don't have to watch your words here." She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Maybe not, but habits take time to break." By midday, the pale sun had coaxed the frost into a thin sheen of water on the fences. Luke set his tools aside and motioned toward the creek. "Come on, there's something I want to show you." She followed him through the grass, her eyes flicking over the land as if committing every contour to memory. When they reached the bend in the creek, he pointed toward a stand of cottonwoods. Eagles nest there every spring. You can see the old one, top fork, right side. Nielli shaded her eyes, searching until she found it. "It's big," she murmured. "They come back to it every year," Luke said. "Add a little more to it each time." Her expression softened, though she kept her gaze on the tree. "Even after storms?" He nodded. "Especially after storms." She was quiet for a long while, her breath visible in the cool air. When she finally looked at him, there was something different in her eyes, not just gratitude, but the faintest trace of trust. That night, as they sat by the fire, she asked, Why did you let me stay?" Luke didn't answer right away. He'd wondered the same thing himself in the first days after finding her in the barn. "Because I know what it's like to need a place to be safe. And I've got room." Her lips pressed together, and she looked down at her hands. "I didn't think anyone would say that without asking for something back." "I'm not asking," he said. She studied him then, really studied him, as though weighing the truth of it. Finally, she nodded once, slow, as if the gesture itself was an agreement. When she rose to turn in for the night, she paused at the edge of the firelight. "Thank you," she said, the words simple but carrying a depth that went beyond politeness. Luke watched her cross the room, the faintest sense that the distance between them had lessened, not gone, but shortened enough to matter. He didn't call it trust, not yet, but he knew they had taken the first real step toward it. The air had changed that afternoon. It wasn't the weather. The sky was still a pale winter blue, the wind mild, but something in the way the land felt, as if it had drawn in a breath and was holding it. Luke noticed it while mending a section of fence, his hands pausing on the wire. He looked toward the trail leading up from the valley and saw a figure on horseback cresting the ridge. Nielli must have felt it too. She stepped out from the barn, her braid loose over her shoulder, eyes narrowing toward the rider. Luke watched her stiffen, every bit of calm she had built over the past weeks retreating into the taut, guarded stance he'd first seen in her. The rider slowed as he approached, a man in a worn deputy's coat, the kind that might still carry weight in some towns. He stopped a dozen yards out, dismounted, and held the reins loosely, as if to show he wasn't here for a fight. But Luke knew enough to see the tension in his posture. "Afternoon," the man called, his voice too casual. "Name's Hayes. I'm looking for an Apache woman, about so tall, long black hair. Word is, she came through here." Luke's grip tightened on the fence post. "You're on my land," he said evenly. "If you've got business, you can state it and be on your way." Hayes smiled thinly. "My business is her. There's a claim on her from the sheriff's office in White Bluff." His eyes shifted to Nielli, cold and assessing. "You match the description." Nielli's breath came quicker, though she didn't step back. Luke moved, putting himself between her and Hayes without thinking. "There's no claim here," he said. Hayes's smile didn't falter, but his hand rested lightly on his belt. "That's not for you to decide." Luke's voice dropped. "It is if you're standing on my ground." For a long moment, no one moved. The winter light caught on the metal of Hayes's badge, the edges worn, the shine dulled. Finally, he gave a short laugh, as if this were just a friendly disagreement. "I'll be back," he said, swinging into the saddle. "Next time, I'll bring papers." They watched him ride off, his figure shrinking against the pale hills, until he was gone. Luke turned to Nielli. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. "You knew him?" he asked. Her eyes stayed on the ridge where Hayes had disappeared. Men like him don't need to be known. They're all the same. He wanted to tell her he wouldn't let Hayes take her, but he knew words like that weren't earned in a single breath. Instead, he said, "We'll be ready if he comes back." That evening, they worked in quiet harmony, hauling wood to the porch, checking the barn doors, making sure the rifles were loaded. Luke didn't push her to speak, but now and then, he caught her watching him with a look that was less fear and more calculation, as if weighing how far he would really go for her. After supper, she surprised him. "Why?" she asked suddenly. He looked up from the fire. "Why what?" "Why stand in front of me today?" He thought about it, then answered honestly. Because no one should face that alone. Not here, not while I'm standing. Her gaze held his for a long time, as though testing the truth in his words. At last, she nodded once and leaned back in her chair. Then I'll stand with you, too. It was a small thing, but Luke felt it, a shift, like the first thaw loosening the ground after a long freeze. Days passed without Hayes returning, but the shadow of his visit lingered. Luke noticed Nielli moving differently, more alert but also more certain, as though she'd made some decision she hadn't yet voiced. She joined him in the pastures, her eyes scanning the ridges with the same habit he had. One morning, as they repaired the paddock, a pair of riders appeared on the far trail. Luke saw Nielli tense, but these men veered wide, tipping their hats in passing. She let out a breath she'd been holding, then glanced at him. "I keep thinking of the eagle nest," she said. He looked over, curious. "They don't leave after storms," she said. "They just make the nest stronger." Luke's mouth curved in the faintest smile. That's one way to look at it. The threat might still come, but something had changed between them. They were no longer just sharing a space, they were guarding it together. And for Luke, that was enough to believe they could weather whatever came next. It happened 3 days later, just after dawn. Luke had been up early, splitting logs in the pale light, his breath fogging in the cold air. The sound of hoofbeats reached him before he saw the riders, steady and unhurried, like men who knew they had time. Nielli was in the barn, feeding the mare, when the first shadow crossed the yard. She froze, a scoop of grain still in her hand, her eyes narrowing at the figures approaching. Luke stepped into the open, the axe still in his grip, watching as Hayes rode up with 2 others. Hayes dismounted with a self-satisfied ease, his badge catching the faint light. "Morning, Carver," he said, as if they were old friends. "I told you I'd be back. Got the papers right here." He pulled a folded sheet from his coat, the edges smudged with dirt. Luke didn't move closer. "You can keep your papers," he said. Hayes's smile was almost pleasant. "That's not how this works. She's coming with us." Behind Luke, Nielli stepped out of the barn. Her chin was high, but her eyes flicked from Hayes to the 2 men flanking him, rougher looking, less inclined to play by any kind of law. Luke felt the shift in the air, the kind of silence that always came before trouble. He set the axe aside slowly, his hands empty now, but ready. "You'll leave the same way you came," he said, voice low. One of Hayes's men snorted. "Or what?" Luke's gaze was steady. "Or you won't be riding out." For a moment, no one moved. The wind whispered through the dry grass, the only sound between them. Hayes took a step forward, holding out the paper like it meant something. "She's a fugitive," he said. "Run from White Bluff after knifing a man. You hiding her makes you an accomplice." Nielli's voice cut through the morning air. "The man I knifed had me tied to his bed for 3 days." The words hung there, raw and unflinching. One of Hayes's men shifted uneasily, but Hayes didn't flinch. "Doesn't change the charge." Luke stepped forward, closing the distance by half. "It changes everything," he said. "You think I'm handing her over so some backwater court can pretend they care about justice? You're wrong." Hayes's eyes narrowed. "Last chance, Carver." Luke's hand hovered near the rifle propped against the porch post. "You'd better make it your last, too." The standoff stretched until Hayes finally exhaled through his nose, turning as if this was simply a matter for another day. But Luke saw the way his jaw worked, the way his men's hands lingered near their weapons. This wasn't over. They rode off, dust curling behind them, and Luke knew they'd be back. Maybe not with words next time. That evening, the house felt smaller, the shadows longer. Nielli sat by the fire, her hands still, her eyes distant. Luke watched her, knowing she was running through the same calculations he was. How many bullets? How much food? How long they could hold out if it came to that. "Do you believe me?" she asked suddenly. Luke leaned forward in his chair. "I didn't need to hear it to believe you. But yes." Her eyes softened just slightly. "Then I'll stay." The next 2 days were a quiet kind of preparation. Luke reinforced the barn doors, checked the fence lines for weak spots, and kept the rifle close. Nielli helped without being asked, hauling water, setting extra feed for the livestock, keeping the firewood stacked high. At night, they spoke little, but the silence between them felt different now. It wasn't the distance of strangers, it was the weight of two people waiting together, trusting that when the moment came, they'd stand side by side. The attack came at dusk. Luke heard the horses first, then the low voices. Hayes had brought 4 this time, all armed. They came straight for the yard, fanning out as they dismounted. Luke stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "You've had your warning," Hayes smirked. "And you've had your chance." The first man moved toward the barn. Luke fired into the dirt at his feet. "Next one goes higher," he said. Nielli appeared at the doorway, her own rifle raised, the barrel steady. Hayes's eyes flicked to her. Perhaps surprised she was armed. "This is your line, Hayes," Luke said. "You cross it, you don't ride back." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the barn lantern and the shifting of horses. Then Hayes swung back into the saddle, his men following reluctantly. "You'll regret this, Carver," he said. Luke didn't answer. He stood there until their shapes disappeared into the falling dark. Only then did he lower his rifle. Nielli stepped beside him, close enough their shoulders touched. "You meant it," she said quietly. He turned to her, his voice steady. "So did you." And for the first time, he saw it in her eyes, not just the guarded strength of survival, but the unspoken truth that they were no longer fighting alone. The morning after Hayes rode away, the air felt strangely still. It wasn't the easy quiet of their usual days. It was the taut stillness of two people who had stood on the edge together and hadn't yet stepped back. The yard was littered with tracks, deep imprints of hooves pressed into the damp earth, each one a reminder that trouble could find them again. Luke walked the fence line with the rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning for weak spots, though he knew it wasn't wood and wire that had kept them safe. It was resolve. Nielli was by the barn, brushing down the mare with steady, even strokes. He caught himself watching the way her shoulders moved, strong and deliberate, and how the morning light caught in her hair. There was a steadiness in her now that hadn't been there when she first stepped out of the shadows weeks ago. They didn't speak much that day, but the silence wasn't born of fear. It was something heavier, the understanding that staying together had stopped being a question and become a fact. By midday, Luke had finished his rounds and found Nielli on the porch, mending a torn shirt. She glanced up briefly, then back to her work. "You think they'll come again?" she asked, her voice even but not careless. "They might," he said, leaning against the post. "But if they do, we'll be ready." She tied off the thread and set the shirt aside. "We," she repeated, almost testing the word. Luke met her eyes. "We," he confirmed. That evening, they shared a meal without rush. Beans simmered over the fire, bread from the last batch she'd baked. The wind rattled the shutters, but inside, The room was warm. Luke found himself telling her about the years after the war, the drifting from one job to another, the way the land had been the only thing to quiet his head. She listened without interrupting, her gaze steady on him as if each word mattered. When it was her turn, Nielli spoke of the river she grew up beside, the brothers she hadn't seen in years, and the way she'd stopped counting the places she'd been forced to leave. Her voice stayed calm, but Luke caught the flicker in her eyes when she mentioned the last man who'd claimed her. He didn't press. Some things could stay in the dark until she was ready. Over the next week, life settled into a rhythm again, but it wasn't the same rhythm as before. They worked side by side more often now, mending a section of fence together, hauling water from the well, clearing brush along the west edge of the property. Every task felt like it carried more weight, as if each nail driven or post set was another anchor keeping her here. One afternoon, while they were stacking firewood, Nielli paused and leaned on the handle of the axe. "You didn't have to stand in front of me that day," she said, almost to herself. Luke set the log he was holding onto the pile. "Yes, I did." Her eyes softened, but she didn't smile. "I don't want to be another burden you have to carry." "You're not," he said. The words came out certain, because they were true. "You've been carrying yourself a long time. I'm just here beside you now." That night, she didn't retreat to her room after supper. Instead, she stayed by the fire with him, the two of them sharing the kind of quiet that didn't need to be filled. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, whispering like it always did. But inside, Luke felt the edges of his solitude softening. The next morning brought frost on the ground, crisp underfoot as Luke stepped out to check the water trough. Nielli came out behind him, wrapped in her shawl, her breath misting in the cold air. They stood there together for a long moment, looking out over the land, not as owner and guest, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two people who had chosen the same ground to stand on. She turned to him, her voice quiet but certain. "If I stay, it won't be because I have nowhere else to go." Luke looked at her, the pale morning light washing over her face. "I know," he said, and just like that, it was decided. Not spoken in some formal agreement, not marked with a handshake or a promise, but sealed in the way she stepped past him into the day's work without hesitation, and the way he fell into step beside her. From then on, there was no line between his life and hers. They repaired the roof together before the first snow, stored enough wood to see them through winter, and stacked food in the pantry. Some days they spoke often, other days they said little. But always, there was that unspoken agreement. They belonged here, and they belonged beside each other. By the time the first flakes fell, the memory of Hayes and his men had dulled, though not disappeared. The land was quiet again, but Luke knew peace wasn't the absence of trouble. It was the choice to hold your ground when it came. And now, for the first time in years, he wasn't holding it alone. By the time the first hard frost had silvered the grass, the ranch had changed in ways that couldn't be measured in fence posts or stacked firewood. The place looked the same from a distance. The weathered boards, the small barn, the sweep of open land. But for Luke Carver, every inch felt different now. And for Nielli, it had become more than a shelter. It was a place she had walked into without a promise and stayed in without a chain. That winter, the days were short but steady. Mornings began with the smell of coffee and the scrape of boots on the porch, and ended with the glow of lamplight against the frost-dark windows. Luke worked the stock, repaired gear, and kept the woodpile high. Nielli baked bread that steamed in the cold air, tanned hides for new gloves, and kept the small home warm in ways no fire could. They spoke more easily now, the conversations flowing between work and quiet moments, stitched with pauses that held no strain. He asked about her brothers. She asked about the years after the war. Sometimes they answered in full. Other times, a look or a single sentence was enough. There was no debt between them, no keeping score. Just the steady giving and receiving that made the long nights feel short. Neighbors began to notice the change. A man alone on a ranch could grow closed to the world. But Luke was different now. Not louder, not softer, but anchored in a way that was hard to miss. Nielli, too, carried herself differently. She no longer moved like someone ready to run. She walked the property with her head high, her steps sure, as if the ground itself had agreed to keep her. The lesson they were learning together was simple, but not easy. Survival was only the start. The harder part was letting someone in close enough that survival could turn into living. Snow came in heavy one week, burying the fence lines and icing over the creek. They worked side by side to clear paths, break the ice for the stock, and keep the fire fed. There were no grand speeches, no declarations. The work itself was the language they shared, a way of saying, "I'm here, I'm staying, I've got you." One evening, after a long day shoveling drifts from the barn doors, they sat by the fire, mugs in hand. Outside, the wind howled over the roof, but inside, it was warm. Nielli set her mug down and looked at Luke for a long moment before speaking. "You didn't just give me a place to stay," she said. "You gave me the choice to stay." Luke didn't answer right away. He reached over, covering her hand with his, and the quiet between them said enough. As winter deepened, the bond they had formed in fire and threat began to root itself in small things. The way she would set an extra piece of bread on his plate without asking. The way he would leave his gloves by the stove for her to find warm. In these gestures lived the truth they both understood. Love wasn't something they had chased, but something they had built without naming. When spring finally broke, the thaw was slow, the fields muddy and uneven. But with it came a kind of renewal neither of them had expected. Luke rebuilt the corral. Nielli planted the first rows of a garden. They moved through the work together, not as two lives running parallel, but as one life shared. The day they finished the garden fence, they stood back and looked at it. The fresh posts lined neat and straight. Nielli brushed the dirt from her hands and glanced at Luke. "I think it's going to take root," she said, and though she meant the garden, Luke knew she meant more. And he realized something then, the lesson that had been unfolding since the night she first stepped out of his barn. Safety wasn't just about walls or weapons. It was about having someone who would stand their ground beside you, not because they had to, but because they chose to. For Luke, that choice had given him back more than a partner. It had given him purpose. For Nielli, it had given her more than shelter. It had given her a life she had built on her own terms. In the years to come, they would still face storms and strangers, the kind of trials the West never ran out of. But they would face them the same way they had faced everything else, together, steady and unshaken. If you've stayed with this story all the way through, I want to thank you. Luke and Nielli's journey isn't just about survival in the Wild West. It's about the quiet courage it takes to let someone stay in your life, and the strength it takes to stay in theirs. If this story has touched you, I'd love for you to like the video, leave a comment about what part stayed with you most, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Your voice here matters, and your support keeps these tales alive.